Yeah, we're good. We're going.
Awesome. How's it going, everybody? Today we're joined by Whitney Dikoume, and I totally nailed that last name,
Got
so I'm
it.
happy about it. Whitney is an athletic therapist. She is amazing at her job. She works for is it Acumen Therapy is what they're called?
Acumen Performance.
Acumen Performance in
Mhm.
Calgary. It's based in the south. I believe it is by 130th Ave. So definitely check them out if you are interested. Whitney, as well as an athletic therapist, is an ambassador for Under Armour, representing the brand. I got my Under Armour sweater on actually. Yeah, love it. Yeah, there you go. You
Yep.
got it as well. Awesome. So today we're going to be asking her quite a few questions about training, her philosophy, mobility, warm up, cool downs, all that fun stuff. So super happy to have her on here. So V's, you want to ask her first about her philosophy? You said.
Yeah, Whitney. Again, we all know each other. Whitney and I have spoke before, and I was just fascinated when she was telling me about her philosophy behind uh, basically training for athletic performance, and it's really interesting. So, if you just want to talk about that for a little bit, and then we'll just ask questions from there based on that.
Yeah, of course. So, like I said, my name is Whitney, and I am an athletic therapist. Whenever I am working with people, my main goal is not just to give them exercise, but it's also to make sure that they are educated while I'm giving them exercises. Because down the road, I want people to be able to make the right decisions for themselves. So going into a training session, there's always an assessment. It's me figuring out where exactly you are right now, what are goals you want to get to, and what are different movements that you've been doing in your life that might be impeding you without you realizing that. And during our session, it's about making sure that you understand why we're doing an exercise, how that's going to help you in your daily life, um, and what are things that you can do on your own to make sure that you're not in pain or that your mobility is getting better. Because I find a lot of people are unaware of how their body moves and what your body needs to be doing for them to be pain free. And they're going to be like, yeah, like my knees hurt. And then there's this one movement that you're doing all the time that's causing your knee pain. While if you are educated on how the knee works, you're going to be smart enough to be like, okay, maybe I shouldn't do this, or I should take a rest from this, or, so my biggest thing is just educating people.
So from
No,
that,
that's
oh,
I actually noticed that when. Go ahead, V's. Go
oh, I
ahead.
was just gonna say, like from that educational approach, you're looking to teach people
Mm-hmm.
basically how to move and what feels good versus what doesn't feel good, and instruct them in ways that are going to develop better habits. How does that build into athletic performance?
So with athletic performance, the biggest thing is that you need mobility and you need strength. And whenever you're working with someone, or whenever I'm working with someone or any like strength and conditioning coach, the important thing is making sure that if I'm going to load a joint, I need to know what it feels like when that joint is being loaded properly. Because if the joint is being loaded properly, that's when injuries happen, whether it's overuse or ligaments or tendons are being injured. So whenever let's say I'm having someone do a squat, I'm going to be like, okay, let's do a squat. And at the bottom of your squat, what does that feel like? They should be able to tell. Because if you're transferring that over to, let's say, a basketball player in the court, when you're down in your defensive stance, you should be able to be down in the squat and be like, all right, this feels right, this doesn't feel right. Because most times, whenever athletes get injured, their body always gave them an indication of something's wrong. And they're like, oh, I'm fine, I'm just going to push through it. And that's when the injury happens.
Mm.
So if you are training for athletic performance, you should be able to tell what your body is doing when it's right and when it's not right. So when you're on the court and something feels off, you're like, okay, maybe I need to stretch this during my next break, or maybe I need to talk to someone, before the next game or something like that.
And when it comes down to, because you're talking about squatting here, what's your
Mm-hmm.
philosophy on the knee positioning of when it comes down to squatting? Like how like what is a proper what should a proper squat look like?
So there's a lot of discussion going on around whether it's like knees over the toes or not knees over the toes, whether it's back squat or front squat. And what I always tell people, once the way you squat is going to be personalized to you. The way I'm going to have someone that's 6'4" squat is going to be completely different than the way I'm going to have like someone that's 5'4" squat. And also the way I'm going to have someone who has longer legs, then torso squat is going to be completely different than the way I have someone that's like equal on both sides. So when you're squatting, the main things like you want to be able to make sure that your glutes are firing. So for like athletes, I barely have athletes squat below 90 degrees because I'm like, again, for athletic performance, when are you going to be in that position where your knees are past 90 degrees? If we're working on trying to strengthen the tendons, then having your knees go over your toes is the best thing to do because that's where you're actually stretching the quad and the patella tendon. But then if you are dealing with like PFPF, which is like knee pain, why would I have you do squatting over your toes if it's really inflamed? Because I do not want to load the tendon then. I want to get your glutes working. I want to get your hamstrings working. And when the inflammation is down in the tendon, then we can start loading it with front squats or squatting and letting your knees go over your toes. So it's very individualized, and you have to know who you're working with and what you're trying to achieve with your squat.
And do you find so you're talking about glutes firing. Do you find that athletes in general are pretty decent at activating their glutes, or do you find a lot of them still struggle with it, or is it more individual based, or is it more sports based?
It's a bit of both. Like it can be individual based and it can be sport based. I find a lot of athletes that are body aware, they know how to use their glutes. They know what it feels like when their glutes are firing and when their glutes are not firing. And sometimes it's just like patterns that you develop. You know, like if you are, trying to think of an example, but if you're in a sport that involves like a lot of jumping, you're never going to drop down into 90 degrees. So you're never going to put yourself in that position where your glutes have to fire, because your glutes fire when your hip gets into full extension, right? So if you're not in full extension, how often are you going to use your glutes that much, right? Yeah. So it definitely depends on the sports, depends on the individual, depends on like dominant side too. You know, like you're going to see, it's something that I do with assessments. You're going to find some athletes are very comfortable going one way because that's the side you're supposed to be in the sport, and then you take them out of their position and your body just does not know how to work. But in that case, you're like thinking of life post sports, and like, yes, you're really good at moving towards your right, but when you're not playing sports, you need to move towards your left. Then that's a case where you might find like one glute is not as strong as the other one. So then we'll start working on the other glute to make sure that, yes, in your athletic performance, you're able to do what you're supposed to do. But if I take you out of that world, you're still functioning.
Is that how a lot of injuries end up happening? It's just like a lot of times the one side gets stronger just because, you know, maybe it's a position that you play, right? Maybe you're playing right wing, so you end up turning from one side more often than the other or whatever it is. So then is that what's something that causes most injuries you find?
Yes. Yeah, one of the reasons for sure. So I know I've kind of spoken to both of you about this, but there's something called fascia lines and myofascial lines, and those are different muscles and fascia around your body that work together to support you. So you've got lines that go from the left side of your body, in your like lower body, and they end up in your right shoulder, and they go on both sides. So if I am always using just one side, I'm going to have one connection that's really, really strong, and it's going to be stabilizing me. But then I get out of that, and then the other side doesn't know how to work. So then the side that I've been using to stabilize me just takes over. So and that's why you end up having like overuse injuries or lack of range of motion. And then when you have lack of range of motion, whether it's in your knees or in your hips, something else is going to try and make up for that lack of range of motion, and that's when injuries happen.
I see. Now, one thing I want to ask you about is actually because part of it is because I saw your post on Instagram about whether do you run? Did you take on running because of the COVID break, and do you warm up before your runs? And it made me think about when I was a kid, I used to just go. I used to just go for runs as, you know, I just go, and I wouldn't really warm up. I just go, and then my runs are kind of like my warm up. And now if I go for a run as a if I go for a run as a warm up, I still need to warm up for my warm up, basically. So now what I'll ask you about is like, what does a real efficient warm up look like for if you're, you know, whether you're going for a run, playing sports, or does it differ? Like, should your warm up be different if you're just going for a run versus if you're getting into a game or a practice or whatever?
So efficient warm up is one that includes range of motion into whatever joint you're going to be using it for. It includes some kind of activation. So for running, my warm-ups could be a couple leg swings because it's easy to do. You can do them anywhere. And then I might do a couple side steps, again, just to kind of make sure that my glutes are working. And I could do like a single leg balance. Because if I'm going to go on a run, I want to make sure that my ankle is able to stay enough to absorb the force I'm putting through it. Because if your ankle isn't ready for the motion, then your ankle is going to be stiff, and that's where you end up jamming things like your talus, which is like as well as a bone in your ankle that controls mobility. I want to make sure that my glutes are firing, because if I'm going to land on that side and my hips aren't ready for that motion, a lot of it's going to jar up and it's going to go into my lower back. And I also want to make sure I have the mobility. So just in case, I don't know, I'm running on the surface and it's a little bit slippery, my body can adapt to that. Your warm-ups don't have to be, like let's say you're going for a run, your run doesn't have to be 15 minutes or even like half an hour. If you're going for a game, again, I feel like 10 minutes should be good for you to activate the muscles. Like you want to make sure that you're warm enough, right? So that's when like doing like different like running drills is good. But before you do that, you don't have to spend 20 minutes warming up to do a 20-minute warm up to start your game.
Unless you're mean, you're super old and breaking down everywhere, I guess.
It's a lot of time.
That's everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you get to the age where waking up and you hurt yourself sleeping and you're like, how?
Your shoulders hurts. You didn't do anything to it. Yeah. One thing that I was really interested in asking you, as an athletic therapist, your experience with rehabilitating athletes. Do you find that there are, have you noticed any specific factors that separate athletes who have really successful rehabilitation? You know, they're able to get back on the field and be effective right away and not get re-injured, versus athletes who have less effective rehab. You know, maybe they have consistent nagging injuries, or there's issues that keep creeping up that may prevent them from playing a full season constantly. Do you notice like individual differences between those two kinds of athletes?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I noticed is how they go into rehab, the rehab Howard, and what's been injured. They know what the process is going to be like. They know the steps. They're able to make those decisions. Then their rehab is most likely to be successful. While if it's someone that is just there to do what they're being told, they might do it properly when they're with you, but then they go off and they do it on their own, and it's not the same way. And I always tell people, you're with your physio or your athletic therapist or your doctor, you're with them like maybe once, like 1 hour a week. The rest of the time you're on your own. So it's you putting in that work that's going to make the biggest difference than you coming in and seeing somebody. So people who go into rehab being like, all right, I got to put in the work. I am accountable to myself. They do really well. While those who are always expecting somebody else to kind of do it for them, they have a harder time.
Okay. So yeah, just a lot of self accountability,
because we have the same experience.
Yeah.
That's
accountability is a
we have
big
the
thing.
exact same experience coaching goalies. Actually, that's super interesting, because it's the same for us, right? Like goalies are in a game are on their own. There's no coaches telling them what they're doing right or wrong, right? So it's the same exact idea. So that's awesome. Actually, really good to hear. The when it comes down to their let's say to rehab as a whole, do you find that there's some athletes that get hurt, are they always prone to the same injury, or is it all just dependent on how well they do with their rehab?
Well, they do with their rehab, like most times. Like you have people who are just susceptible to injuries. I'm like, in every single team I have worked with as an athletic therapist, there's always that one person that you're like, all right,
they're your best friend. Like, they're always on the trainer's
bubble wrap
table.
you and send you into the game. Like how exactly, right? But I find that when I'm going to go back into those fascial chains. So, for example, if I am helping somebody rehab from an ACL tear, and we're getting to that part where we're beginning to look at strength training, I am going to look throughout that whole fascia line to make sure that I am addressing everything that could pop up. So your ACL, basically, it keeps your tibias, the bone on the bottom of your leg, it keeps from going too far forward. And whenever that happens, most times it's non-contact. And whenever that happens, it's because you've done a movement and you didn't give either your hip was locked and your ankle were locked, and then all the mobility has to come into your knee, and that's when the injury happens. So when I'm helping somebody rehab, I'm like, all right, yes, we're working on strengthening the knee, we're working on getting your balance back, but we have to make sure that your ankle has the mobility that it needs to. We have to make sure that your hip has the mobility that it needs to. We have to make sure that your core can stabilize, because if you go back out and you do the exact same movement, I want to make sure that this time your hips are moving the way they should, your ankle is moving the way you should, and your core is strong enough to absorb that force so you don't get injured down the road. People that come up, it's normally during the rehab process something wasn't addressed and they just modified the way they were moving, and either, let's say in the case of the ACL, it's either the knee or the hip that took the majority of the tension, and then they start to develop pain in those areas.
Talking about hips and knee pains, that's one thing we see quite a bit with goalies is because they go down so much and they're on their knees extending and do all those things. What like it, I hate to use that word, but like what's a quick quote unquote quick fix for like people getting feeling like their hips are tight? Like, is there certain warm ups they can implement, or is it mostly based on the a cool down where maybe it's a rollout, or what would you recommend for those kind of things?
It's making the time for it.
Yeah.
So especially like with goalies and them, like they've got mobility. Like whenever I've worked with goalies before, it's not as if you've got a lack of mobility in your hips, but your hips still feel tight. So then it might not be the hip joint itself, it might be the muscles around. So if you're in one position for like hours during practice and you're coming out of that position, those muscles that have been holding you down there, they're going to be tight. So then after practice or before practice, take time, roll, especially hip flexors. Those are a big one, like hip flexors, TFL, which is like the muscle on the side of your hip that's basically working when you're down in that butterfly position. If you take like maybe 5 minutes after practice and roll those out. Like a lot of times we focus on, my hips are tight, I'm just going to do like a 2-second stretch. And yes, that might help the muscles, but also on top of the muscles, you've got fascia. And in an ideal world, muscle and fascia are, the way I say it, in an ideal world, they should kind of like glide against each other. So if all you're doing is just stretching, like, yes, you're stretching the muscle, but then the fascia is still stuck to that muscle. So you're like, I'm stretching, but my hips still feel tight. Grab a roller, roll, stretch, and see the difference that it makes.
It's mind blowing when you start rolling out for the first time. If you're not used to to roll out that much and you start to roll out, it just changes your life. Like I think I was 18 or 19 when I got a foam roller for the first time, and I used it. Like I remember my back was always hurting, and the first time I rolled out, I was like, oh my god, this is life changing. So that's something. It's interesting because we a lot of times we tell kids about it, and it feels like I think a lot of times the younger goalies, they don't really appreciate it until they hit a certain age where their body starts hurting.
Yeah, you don't. It's one of those things you don't get it until you actually need it. I was the same way. I think as you're mentioning, when I was 21, playing, my hips started to get just really tight, and our therapist just threw me a roller. I was like, "What's this?" And then showed me how to do it. And you get up and you feel like a rubber band as soon as you're done.
Yeah, and there are definitely athletes out there who are who always want the therapist to just do the work. Like, I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna lay on the table and just release it. And I'm like, it's much more efficient if you can just grab your roller and do it on your own, like do it yourself, because then you won't always need somebody else to do it for you.
Yeah, right? Totally. I always said that when you use a lacrosse ball or a foam roller, it's a poor man's massage, is what it is. So it's it's cheap, it's great.
It is. My goal is to have, like, every single house should have a foam roller. Totally. Or a lacrosse ball, like every single house, because there's so many things that you could address just by rolling.
And even just like the amount you sit in general, like, we were on the ice this morning, but I've been working here, just sitting down for the last 5 hours, and just by having a foam roller, you take 5-minute breaks and stretch out. You're just like, ooh, this is so much better after.
Feel taller.
Yeah.
Talking about sitting, actually, do you have any tips for like people who are just sitting all the time? Like, what things that they can do to not just mess up their body? Because for us, like, I mean, even hockey players in general, like, you're on the road quite often, right? Like for coaches, for goalie coaches, I know skills coaches in hockey in general, like, you're on the road driving to rink all the time. You for every hour they spend at the rink, you're spending another hour driving, basically. And then for players, you're on the bus, you're driving to you're driving across the province, go play somewhere. Like, so And it like that wrecks your body. Like I feel it. If I'm ever in a car a lot and my body gets wrecked. So like what would you recommend? Like is the same idea, kind of like roll out, warm up and everything? Is those the things that you would recommend?
Breaks.
Hmm.
So if you are, let's say you're in a team bus and you've got like a 12 hour drive, stand up, walk down the aisle, go sit back down. Like that like 30-second break can do so much for your body because you've stood up, you're stretching your hip flexors. You're not sitting on your piriformis, which is like one of the muscles that if it gets really tight, you start to get like sciatic type pain. You are activating your core, you're relaxing your shoulders, and that, if they say like 30 seconds of that, it makes a difference for your body so that you're not just stiff, right? If you're sitting in an office and you've got the time to like stand up and go roll for a couple minutes, awesome. But the best thing you can do is just move.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. So, yeah, that's something that people in our industry, like anybody that's any coaches listening, that's just killer.
It seems like an
That's their
active
life.
job.
Spending their car.
Yeah. When you tell people like I'm a coach, it always seems like you're in an active job, but you don't really. I think most people don't really think about the travel, how much travel's involved.
Do like if you're watching like tape or film or whatever, like you're sitting down and breaking down people's movements, like, you know.
Yeah.
So
When
yeah.
it comes down to cooling down and stuff, so how long should a cool down be in general, in your opinion? Like, and what should you incorporate in it?
Uh, I think cooldowns should be about 10 minutes. So that's what I do with after a training session. I'll have someone just sit down and hand them the roll, and sometimes I write cooling down programs for them. So the cool down, you want to make sure that you're almost getting your body back to that. I call it equilibrium, so or homeostasis. So it's like basically let's say you've been doing an activity that has required you to be in hip flexion the whole time. Your cool down, the majority of it is going to be trying to get your body back into hip extension, right? So it's going to be stretching out your hip flexors or stretching out your quads or like rolling those same muscles out. If you've been doing an activity that has you standing for a long period of time, like maybe you focus on your glutes a little bit more at the end of the day, or you focus on your hamstrings a little bit more. So like 5 to 10 minutes is usually a good time, and it's always, like I say, work on range of motion, work on the fascia, work on the muscle, and that should take you about like 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. And when you talk about fascia, could you explain to people what fascia means? Because I know we talked about it when we saw you,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, so fascia is this huge connective tissue that kind of goes throughout your body. It's non-contractile, which means that it doesn't tighten up, or sorry, it doesn't fire the way a muscle would, but it's still meant to absorb force. So most times when people have heard of fascia, they think of plantar fascia and plantar fasciitis. So whenever you're doing certain movements, this tissue is going to tighten up and it's going to support you in that movement. But sometimes it can become so tight that it starts to become inflamed. And when that inflammation happens, that's when your body starts to detect it as pain. I'm going to use like plantar fasciitis for an example. You have people who do not know how, like if your arch is not strong enough and it doesn't know how to support you, and you're wearing flip flops all summer, you're going to develop plantar fasciitis because the fascia is going to hold on to you, but then at one point the muscles can't do the work anymore, and the fascia takes the brunt of the work, and then you end up having this like tight feeling. So when you're waking up when you wake up in the morning and you go to stand, and the bottom of your feet just feels like pins and needles, that's fascia. Because it goes all over the body, there are like different lines that it goes through. You've got fascia lines that start at the bottom of your feet and they go towards like the front of your head, and they're meant to support your back. So you're going to find some people who are on their feet their whole day, they end up getting headaches, and it's because the fascia on their feet has gotten too tight, it's pulling on the connection on their head. You have people who have very tight, like the front of your hips or your hip flexors feel really tight. Most times you're going to find that there's a relation to like shoulder pain. They've done research in the States, and apparently a bunch of baseball players, like most of your shoulder injured, if they've injured your shoulder, the opposite hip ends up having issues as well. Because this fascia that goes from one side of the body crosses over, it connects to the opposite side.
interesting.
That's super
Like
interesting.
when you talked about the from the feet up to the head with the headaches, like would a solution to that be rolling out your feet kind of deal?
Rolling up the bottom of your feet. I don't know if you guys have ever seen like a peanut. So it's like it looks like two lacrosse balls that are kind of like
Yep.
combined
Yeah.
together. So yeah, so normally at the end of a long day, like a long work day, I've got like a bigger one at home, and I'm gonna put it at the back of my head and just kind of lay down on it and just like relax. And then that's gonna release the tension in the back of my head, and that's gonna help my feet as well.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
cool.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I wear flip flops almost all year long. If I could wear flip flops all year long, I would. But I roll up my feet all the time, so maybe that's why I don't
Yeah.
get the headaches as much. But I'll keep
Exactly.
that in mind.
Are
I'll
you
keep that in
still
mind though if
are
I
you
start
still
getting
into the
headaches.
toe shoes? Still into the barefoot Vibrams? Walking around?
I still got them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pulled them out. I pulled them in the summer. So yeah, I started wearing them a little bit more lately. Actually, that we're talking about feet and stuff, like, is there when it comes down to shoes and sports shoes? I know they sell different types of shoes for different kinds of workouts, but do you think it matters much, or if let's say you have people training with you, do you like them to wear a specific kind of shoe?
So with training, I prefer bare feet, especially since we've got a private facility. The only reason why when I used to work in like bigger box gyms, it would be like, and they were like, do not take your shoes off, make sure that you have your shoes on the whole time, is liability. Because if someone drops
Mm.
a weight and it ends up on your foot, they're in big trouble. But with having our own private facility, I like to train people barefoot because then I can work on the whole connection. I can work on you being able to keep your big toe down, which fires all the muscles at the bottom of your feet. And if you're doing any type of activity, your feet need to be able to hold you stable, right? If someone's going for a run, we start to look at gait. So whenever you are running, it's like this is like a foot. You've got the heel over here, and then you've got like the big toe. Whenever you're running, you should land on your heel and then do almost like a little like it's called supination. So it's when you land on the outside of your foot, and then you take off your big toe. If you were doing a marathon and you're running for 20, let's say, how long a marathon? 24
I
kilometers?
don't know.
As you
Yeah.
can tell, I'm a huge runner.
Yeah.
It's too long.
um, you're doing that whole distance and you're landing on your heel. You want to make sure that the shoes that you're wearing are ones that they can absorb that pressure so that everything is not going towards your heel. I am not a like barefoot running for long distances because your body can't handle that. Like you need that shock absorption. If you are a sprinter, cleats like like the sprinting cleats, the way they've got like the spikes at the bottom of your feet,
Hmm.
because again, that's where the majority of contact is going
Mm.
into. If you're going to go do a workout at the gym, make sure that you're wearing shoes that are they're not as rigid as running shoes because you need to be able to like do different movements. But again, they should be able to support your foot when you're squatting.
Now, how
Okay.
do you
So if
find?
you're so yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say with hockey players, and I know you and I have talked about this. How do you find that hockey players' ankles and feet move generally? I guess relative to what would be a perfect baseline, just by virtue of being in skates almost constantly.
They Yes. So your ankles are stiff. Like I know we talked about this a little bit, but your ankle is a combination of like four main bones, like just in like the ankle part itself. So you've got your heel, you've got your talus, which is like a lower bone that kind of controls the movement around your ankle, and then you've got the two bones that go from like the from your foot that go all the way down. So if you're in skates the whole day and your skates are really tight, your ankle doesn't know how to adapt into the different ranges of motion that it's supposed to. So whenever you come out of that and you're trying to move and you're trying to get back into like normal movement, it's hard for your ankles to do that. So I would say for hockey players, definitely do a lot of foot mobility after games or practices, or just because your ankles get really really stiff because that talus just does not learn how to move, and if it doesn't learn how to move, it's just stuck the whole time, and then you get out of your skates and you're trying to force it to move when you're wearing like regular shoes or flip flops, and then that's not possible.
So that'd be something, as you mentioned, to add to the cool down, to try to get your body, if you're in a specific pattern normally, to try to bring it back to a baseline. Interesting.
Right, exactly.
Cool.
Lots of calf work too.
Hmm.
Lots and lots of calf work. because if your ankle isn't moving, your calf is going to try and make up for that.
Okay.
That's
I don't know if you guys have ever noticed, but I work with a lot of basketball players, and most of them they walk on their toes because their calves are just so tight.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. If you watch them walk, like
Jumping all the
they
time.
rarely do the whole heel strike to toe because you're just used to being in this like ready to move position. So your calves are like really, really tight.
Do you find because I know you work with a lot of basketball players as well as football, right? So like, what are the differences in their in what you notice and what ends up happening with their bodies based on their sports?
I've noticed like the heel one. Football players, basketball players have very tight, like they have really tight hips, like really, really tight hips. And that's because they're used to being in this quarter squat position and they are in there like the majority of the game.
Okay.
Players, depending on the play, on a receiver. Receivers, I find, would have tighter calves because again, they're in this like ready to go sprinting that field position the whole time. Quarter that like getting over, let's say, like if your right hand left right where they have to some leg against your body. So the sport that you play determines how your body is built. And my philosophy with rehab and with training is like yes, we still want to build those patterns, but I should be able to take you out of those patterns and you should be fine. Not perfect, like I'm not expecting you to be ambidextrous or anything, but you should be able to move both ways. Like I have seen like hockey goalies where it's like, okay, you're like, all right, I'm going to get you to try and stand on your right leg, and they can stand, no problem. You get them to stand on your left leg, and it's like no strength, no stability. So it's like, okay, I know the side you're comfortable with. And when you're on the ice, they don't think about it. That's just where they go. I have basketball players, like point guards that are so comfortable driving one way that you tell them to move the other way, and it's just like your body does not have that connection. So like it's fine for your sport, but you're in your sport for how long? You know, like how many years is it? And then when you get out of that, you end up having all these issues on one side because that's just what you've been using for so long.
That's one thing that's
Oh,
sorry, it was cutting off your side.
Oh.
Yeah, that's one thing that that we never really think about is for hockey players in general. If you're a left-handed player, well, you're always in the same position all the time, and if you're right, it's the opposite, obviously. But you play for, if you're a pro, you've been playing for maybe 20 years at that point, right? Maybe even longer. So that's crazy when you think about the amount of practices, the amount of hours you've been spending on one position, and then when problems start occurring, well, that's years and years of those habits just developing over time, right? So it's it's basically compound interest over time, right? It adds up quite a lot.
And you find the ones who are able to keep on playing relatively pain-free are the ones that they've invested in their body and they know how to move out of those positions. That's why there are a lot of people that advocate for playing multiple sports when you're younger, because it teaches you to get out of your comfort zone of like, I'm always in this position. Like I say, it's really cool when you see like soccer players, maybe try and play volleyball, something that requires you to use your hands, because you don't think about it, or it's like hockey players, like you used to like going back and forth, try tennis. That way you're going sideways now, like it's just moving in a different pattern, but you're still using those same muscles.
Do you so when that's something we've talked a lot about is kids specializing into certain not just a sport, but into specific positions too early. So for you as an athletic therapist, like is there a certain age where you think is okay to kind of transition to specializing? Or, and when they do transition to specializing, I'm assuming they would have to switch over their training, their off season training or whatever it is. They have to obviously do things a little bit differently that way. But is there a certain age where you think would be appropriate to then specialize?
I think this is just my personal opinion. I think like when you're like late junior high to high school is when you can start working on that, because when you're younger than that, you're thinking about growth plates. You know, you might specialize, especially specializing positions. You might specialize in a position, and you're supposed to be a certain height, and then you get into high school and you like, grow like another 4 inches, and suddenly it's like, all right, I can't play this position. I got to switch. So like that 15 to 18 is a good time to start specializing, depending on the sports. Because if we're talking about something like gymnastics, by like 15, like your career is over. Like that's when you've like your chance for the Olympics and stuff like that. But if we're talking about sports like hockey and basketball, or volleyball, I would say like, that 15 to 18 years old is when it's like a good time to start specializing. There's so many basketball players right now that are in the league, and they didn't start playing basketball till they were 14, 15.
Oh, crazy.
Yeah, that's wild.
And they're one of the top players right now.
Yeah, I had no idea about that. That's super interesting, actually.
My home, same thing. Like he, and then I think I might be completely wrong, but I feel like he got drafted in the MLB or something like that. And then he's like, no, like football is the one that I prefer. And you don't have to specialize at 5 years old.
Yeah.
It's crazy because they're like studies of people who've done this, something called the athletic gene. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that book. So you've got type 1 and you've got type 2 muscles, which are like your fast twitching and slow twitch muscles. So I can't remember the details, but they did like a research and they found that a lot of professional athletes had like a combination of both, and they were called type 2X, and it's called the athlete gene. And there was research of people who were actually like testing kids to see like, okay, do you have the athlete gene before we put you in sports? And it's like, that takes a fight from it. Like, what are you doing? So
that's super interesting. It kind of
15 to 18 is like the best time.
Yeah, it kind of shines the light on. You look at the top performing athletes in whatever sport they choose. They're likely top performers no matter what. And they just, when you say they choose to specialize later, they're elite athletes as opposed to just an elite football player or an elite baseball player or an elite hockey player. And that kind of, it just comes full circle when you start to think about when we talked previously about the people who are more successful in rehab, and we find the people who are more successful in goaltending are the ones who can just really pay attention and have a really good awareness of themselves outside of the other people being there. And it goes to show just the work ethic that's involved in being an elite athlete, regardless of which sport the circumstances throw you in, I guess.
Exactly. And I think like we're trying to, and like you guys can pitch in on this, but we're trying to raise and develop athletes. I'm not trying to make just a basketball player or a hockey player. It's like athletes where it's like, you can move and you can move well. How do we help you get there and still do what you love?
And it's something that I think a lot of people don't really realize. When you watch pro athletes doing another sport, they're so good at it. They just pick it up, right? That's just being athletic, right? Very rarely you see somebody being really, really good at like a professional hockey player who's really good at hockey, and he goes to play basketball and you just can't dribble the ball. That just doesn't happen, right? I've never experienced it. It's the same. And obviously, there's exceptions, right? I feel like, if you're a basketball player and you get on skates, you've never skated before, it'll be weird, right? But the how fast you'll be able to pick things up and adjust it's gonna be super fast, right? Compared to somebody who's not very athletic, right? So
it's that body awareness and being very coachable. Like like you guys must have like athletes where you just tell them and you can see the wheels turning in their head and they figure it out. That's how training for performance should be. It's not me putting you in that position. It's me being like, I'm trying to think of like a cue I can think of. Use your hips, or or like load your glutes. And this athlete, they know what that hip hinge looks like, so they automatically do it. So if you're trying to teach a hockey player how to shoot a free throw, when you tell them, okay, go like use your glutes, they're gonna drop down to that position because they have that body awareness.
Now, what if somebody doesn't know? Let's say for example, you have an athlete that doesn't really know how to activate their glutes, right? For you as a trainer, do you like to is it a mix of verbal as well as showing it to them, or is it mostly trying to get them to feel it? But how do you get them to feel it? Is it mostly by showing it to them? Is it by explaining it to them? How do you like to approach it?
It depends on the individual I'm working with. Some people are really good with verbal cues, and others are really good with visuals. So I have this really neat app on my phone, and it shows you how muscles work. So if I show them hip extension, the glute working with hip extension, some people are visual learners and they like automatically get it. Others, I might get them to be in a position where they have no choice but to use that muscle. So for example, I can think of, it's like single leg glute bridges. My cue is going to be like, all right, your goal is not to, so this is like the verbal cues. Your goal is not to lift your hips up as high as you can. Your goal is to drive your heel into the ground. And most people, they do that, and automatically they start to feel the difference between what they were doing before.
Using a different
once
way
in a while,
explaining it basically. It's just saying, hips up, it's driving to the ground. That's interesting.
It's the same movement, but it's for some reason it connects better to some people. So it really depends, and that's how all type of coaching is. Like, it's very individualized. You can't put people in a box and be like, all right, this is the cue that's worked every single person I've worked with before. It has to work with you. It doesn't work that way. Yeah.
With now with you kind of working with athletes as a whole, like, do you do workout programs as well, right? Do you when you put together workout programs, is it a lot of times based on is it mostly based on what you think they need to focus on, or is it mostly based on the sport that they're playing, or is it kind of a mix of both what they need and what they're trying to strive for? How do you approach your workout programs?
It's a mix of both. So right now we are developing. We have an assessment program that we use at Acumen, but we're developing to make it more efficient. That's the best way to put it. So we've got we're using the push program, which is like a wearable technology which calculates velocity and power. We've got what else do we have? We've got a force frame which calculates like strength, like isometric strength, and then we've got different ranges of different tools that calculate range of motion. So whenever someone comes in, we always do an assessment where it's like, all right, let's have you just do general movements. It would be something called the functional movement screen, and it looks at squatting. So from their squat, I can tell what their hip range of motion is, what their knee range of motion is, what their ankle range of motion is, and how they work together. And then we'll have them do lunges, and I'll have them do movements where they're bringing their arm over their head. And we've got the base that if you were lifting arm over your head, you should be at 160 to 180 degrees before you feel pain or discomfort. And if you're feeling the pain or discomfort, then it's like, okay, why? So then we take all that assessment and I sit down with them and we talk about goals. I'm like, so we talk about your history. So what is what sport are you playing? What level are you playing it at? What's your training program? Because we want to make sure that the need is for your training program to be like a burden over everything else that you're doing. There's less adherence to that. And then once we figure that out, we go to the drawing board. We're like, okay, shoulder range of motion was not where we needed to be. Hip range of motion was not where we needed to be. So then when I'm building your program, those are two things that I'm addressing, and I'm addressing the range of motion in it, and I'm addressing the strength in it. And the individual that I'm working with understands why those are being addressed. And then sometimes just with range of motion, it's crazy how different someone's movement becomes and how efficient they are.
So is there
it's a combination of both for sure.
yeah, is there an order when you're designing, say, just use the hockey off season for example? It's about four months.
Mhm.
Do you
Yeah,
hit all three points at once? Like, do you hit range of motion, strength, and conditioning all together? Do you build that into a program throughout all of the all 4 or 5
I
months, or do you hit one first and then slowly build into the others?
I do, but at different rates.
Okay.
So the first time, the first couple of weeks or the first month, it's a lot of range of motion, and then building the strength in the range of motions that you're good at, right? And then by the end of the off season, I know your range of motion is good. I know your strength is good. So then we start to do plyometrics and start to throw power because I'm like, if I ask you to jump, we've done the range of motion, your hips should be able to handle it. If I ask you to change direction, your ankle should have the mobility where it can do that. So then if I'm asking you to do it fast and with force, then you are ready to go on the ice and skate and change direction without any issues because we've worked on that from the beginning. So it starts with a lot of range of motion and body awareness, but we're still building strength in what you're comfortable at. And by the end, I can throw anything your way and you're comfortable with all of it. That's the goal.
Yeah, I was just curious because I wonder how, and you obviously have experience. What's adherence like when athletes first start coming into the off season, and a lot of times their training protocol may have changed from primarily being strength based to getting into strictly range of motion, where they're not lifting weights, they're not doing what a lot of people classify as quote hard work. They're not really maybe not sweating or physically working as hard or generating as much power output. They have to slow things down and get into a range of motion. Do you find a difference in adherence in those
Not
circumstances?
really.
No? Okay.
Not
Yeah.
really. And the reason why is because there is still strength components to it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So because your hip mobility might not be as great as we need it to be, it doesn't mean that we're not going to load your shoulders if your shoulders have great mobility. So
Sure.
you're still getting work done, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes the body awareness part can be just as difficult as like doing like a max deadlift
Totally. Totally.
because just being able to stabilize like those little muscles, getting them to stabilize you, you'd be surprised how many people are like sweating and they're like, I should not be sweating doing this, and I'm like, yeah, because you're working really hard. It doesn't feel like it, but it's a lot of work.
We already hit the
Yeah,
6
we're
p.m.
at
mark, and I know
6,
you
yeah.
got somewhere to go. So thanks
Yeah,
for
thanks
coming
a
on.
lot.
That was
No
awesome.
worries. Thank you guys for
We'll have to do it again
having
because
me.
I know we still have some questions that we want to ask you. So we'll have to do it. We'll have to do it
Of
again
course.
at some point. And we've been having. I know the screen's been freezing a bunch. We're gonna have to get
Yeah.
on Zoom instead next time and
Yeah.
and get a better software. But thanks a lot. Thanks lots for coming on. And yeah, we'll put your social media on the video description so that people can check you out as well. So because you have Instagram, you have your website as well. Is there anywhere else that we
Yes.
should add?
No, those are the two ones that I'm mostly on there. And yeah, if anyone's got any question, feel free to send them my way. I love having conversations like this. So
No, it's
Awesome.
if you guys
Yeah.
check out Whit's Instagram, she's got tons of info on there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great place to check out. So I definitely recommend it. So so thanks a lot for watching. We appreciate it. Thanks Whit for coming on.
you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
No worries. Well,